I was particularly pleased to be asked to moderate this event because our guest tonight and I have what to me certainly is very treasured memory. We were both in St. Peter's Square on the night that Pope Francis was elected. When the name Bergoglio was announced from the balcony of St. Peter's, I whipped round to the person next to me in the square with my microphones and asked for a reaction. It was a young American, and he said, "I have no idea who he is, but I know he'll be a great pope," which sort of made me smile at the time, but actually was quite an acute piece of Vaticanology, because none of us, or at least I certainly didn't know very much about who he was. And very quickly, he generated extraordinary expectations about the kind of pontificate that he was going to bring. And I think, Christopher, that's probably the point at which we should start this conversation. You've been following what's happened ever since then, and your fascinating book is the product of what you've seen. But can you begin by just taking us back to, well, to use a phrase from Vatican II that you quite often use in the book, what the hopes and fears included, that were generated when he was elected?
Well, that's right. Thank you, Ed, and welcome everyone to this discussion. I remember that night that you talk about very vividly. I was in the square as well, amongst many thousands of people, and heard the name Bergoglio, and I was very surprised. Now, there were some Vaticanologists who predicted that Bergoglio might be in the running, and there were some who saw it happening, but I have to confess I didn't at that point. It was a big surprise, and I think that that Cardinal Bergoglio was perhaps a strong candidate, but they didn't expect Pope Francis to appear necessarily on the balcony. That's some of the cardinals who chose Cardinal Bergoglio, because this was the first time that we had a pope calling himself Francis, the first Latin American pope, the first Jesuit pope, and it really did cause, I think, a great stir, and it was kind of a shock to see an institution that some people have perhaps written off, bringing a very creative, making a very creative choice of who they were going to have, who's going to be chosen to lead the church. So I think the hopes at that moment of when the Pope is that we were going to see a new kind of ministry in the office of St. Peter, on the chair of St. Peter. Francis appeared on the balcony, and his first word was "Buonasera," good evening, almost like a parish priest introducing himself to his congregation for the first time. He showed a certain humility and simplicity. He asked for the people in the square to bless him. That was an extraordinary thing. We hadn't seen that before. He'd taken the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, the saint of peace and poverty. So it was a moment, I think, of hope for perhaps a new beginning.
One of the things I remember people saying endlessly at the time, or certain Vatican commentators, Catholic commentators, was that he'd face a huge uphill battle in dealing with the Curia, the Vatican civil service. And there was an expectation that it would prove to be a conservative force in the way perhaps it was during the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. But I mean, just reading your book, I don't get a sense that really happened. That was sort of the dog that didn't bark, in a way, wasn't it?
Well, I think there has been opposition to Francis in the Curia, but it's more the sort of silent, passive opposition, and I write about that in the book. As it's sort of the Yes Minister episode, where the civil servant tells the Prime Minister, "Yes, we must do this, but perhaps not quite in this way. You know, we must help the poor Holy Father, but I'm not sure opening the doors of the Sistine Chapel is a good idea." Is that kind of opposition from within the Curia. But you're right, it hasn't been quite the opposition that we've seen in other parts of the church to Francis. The Curia, I think, has in some respects been reformed by the Pope, certainly in mentality. I think if you talk to bishops who come to Rome for their what the ad limina visits every 5 years, bishops from around the world are required to go to Rome, submit reports, and talk to senior officials. If you speak to them, they say that there's a totally different atmosphere. In the past, they went to Rome and they were told, you know, you're doing this right, you're doing this wrong, change this, change that. It was like going to the command control center to get their orders. Now they go to Rome and they meet the officials and they say, the senior people in the Vatican say, well, look, tell us what's going on. I want to listen. I want to have a dialogue. So I think in that sense, the Pope has been able to change some of the culture in the Curia. And I think that some of the real opposition comes from other parts of the church.
Well, one of those, and again, I think this was something that we didn't think of, I certainly didn't think of at the time, reading your book, appears to be the American church, or at least a very significant section in the American church, if not the American church as a whole. Is that fair?
Well, I think some elements of the American church have been really deeply opposed to Francis. Not all. American church, the church in the United States is a big entity.
You say he doesn't like the idea of a culture war, but of course in your book you use the word battle, and a battle to reform the church.
The Synod on the Family was a kind of moment where some of the opposition to Francis really bubbled up onto the surface. And I think you might say that the Pope possibly made a strategic mistake by trying to focus at the beginning, before the Synod started, trying to focus very much on this shift for giving communion to divorced and remarried Catholics. And the Pope got Cardinal Casper to give a talk in February 2014, before the first round of meetings on the Synod on the Family, and he got Cardinal Casper to put forward the case for why there should be some change. And I think that, rather than the cardinals listening to that and saying, yes, we're all in favour, it actually brought up quite a lot of opposition.
And it's worth just pointing out, isn't it, that I was going to say the change on communion for remarried Catholics, it wasn't really a change, was it? Sort of opening to a change in a way, slightly unclear, and it was in a footnote, which was an odd place for a big change to be.
Well, that's right, and I think that was because of that earlier. I think the Pope accepted that earlier strategic mistake, which was to focus too much on that one issue, that he then placed it in the footnote.
All right, let's turn to the Amazon summit, which attracted a huge amount of attention. What was he trying to achieve, hoping to achieve with that?
Well, I think one of the things that Francis has tried to do, I think, with the papacy is become more of a prophetic voice. And he has quite a good record of making sure the church is sort of ahead of the curve on big issues. So he decided that the church should look at the question of the Amazon and what, again, was the pastoral strategy and what was the presence of the church like in the Amazon, how that could be bolstered and improved. And he decided that it was 2 years before the actual synod took place. And then, of course, a month before the synod, the whole world was focused on the Amazon with the relations to the Amazon wildfires that were spreading throughout the region. And I think the Pope's approach to this summit, the synod, was twofold. One was, how could the church improve its presence in the Amazon, where the church is really one of the few places stand people of the region who are often under persecution, driven off their land, and also implement a very important prophetic document that the Pope produced in 2015, Laudato Si, which of course is the focus that he has brought to the protection of the environment. It's really an updating of Catholic social teaching to include ecological concerns and social concerns. So I think it's that twofold approach, the presence of the church in the region and the commitment to the protection of the planet. I think he is trying to lead the church in a renewed sense to reform the papacy, to, in a sense, connect the faith of the gospel to everyday life, to everyday reality, to reject the idea of a museum-style faith, but bring about the living tradition of the church.
I just want to say thank you very much to everybody. It's been incredibly enjoyable, actually, looking at listening to the debate, listening to Ed and to Chris, but looking at all your faces and your bookshelves and seeing your reaction to what you've been hearing. Particular thanks to Chris for all the work he does for the tablet from Rome. He describes himself as an insider's outsider, or the outsider's insider. Thanks to Ed Stourton for the way that you've brought all these different voices together. Thanks to Ian Farrer for organising it. The tablet is a kind of well, Christianity, what is it? It's a conversation that's gone on for 2,000 years and is still going on. Conversation between the present and the past, between people all over the world. And the tablet, in a way, is just a little corner, a place where that conversation takes place. And we do it in print and online. And now we're starting to see another way that we can carry on this conversation.